The Toronto Police Service announces the Counter-Terrorism Unit and Task Force Guardian. What does this really mean on the scope of terrorism in Canada? Find out on Critical Chris, The Roundup. Welcome to the first episode of Critical Chris, The Roundup. Just enough content to get a little dose of politics. Chief of Police Myron Demkiw and the Toronto Police Service announced new measures on March 24, 2026 to prevent, detect, and disrupt extremist violence and terrorism in an attempt to reassure communities. He claims that this is due to the increasingly volatile security environment, global conflicts, extremist ideologies, and the online radicalization. Myron Demkiw claims that the TPS has experienced a sustained and increased demand related to counterterrorism, criminal extremism, public order, and hate-motivated incidents.
As you know, tensions around the world are extremely high right now. As the biggest municipal police service in Canada, we are operating within an increasingly volatile security environment. Global conflicts, extremist ideologies, and online radicalization, hostile foreign states, heightened polarization. These are realities that impact our work and that impact the sense of safety in our communities.
He specifically highlighted incidents such as the shooting at synagogues a few weeks prior and the United States consulate here in Canada, as well as terrorist attacks abroad.
Just last year, our Intelligence Services Security Section experienced sustained and increased demand related to counterterrorism, criminal extremism, public order, and hate-motivated incidents. Addressing this demand required significant resources. A few weeks ago, synagogues were shot at here in Toronto, and so was the United States consulate.
Chief Demkiw goes on to announce that a new counterterrorism security unit is being created to substantially increase resources dedicated to countering terrorism and violent extremism. He states it will have a robust analytical capacity and dedicated leadership. According to Demkiw, the CTSU will serve as a rapid response hub to improve information and sharing and partnership with the OPP and the RCMP.
This is why today we're announcing the creation of a new counterterrorism security unit. Within this unit, we will substantially increase the resources dedicated to countering terrorism and violent extremism and support this work with a robust analytical capacity and dedicated leadership.
He notes the new unit is not a response to a particular threat, but rather a proactive measure to address the growing volume and complexity of threats.
The key words here are rapid response. I want to be clear today that this announcement is not about any particular threat, but the growing volume and complexity of threats related to terrorism, extremism, and hate-motivated incidents. This is about being proactive.
He also announced the launch of Task Force Guardian. It will involve the deployment of Toronto police officers with tactical capabilities and patrol rifles to locations such as places of worship and tourist hubs to proactively deter violence and reassure communities.
We're also announcing today the launch of Task Force Guardian. We know that visible police presence matters when it comes to deterring violence and reassuring our communities. As part of Task Force Guardian, Torontonians can expect to see Toronto police officers deployed with tactical capabilities, including patrol rifles. If you see these officers, whether it's around places of worship or tourist hubs, it does not mean there's an imminent threat. What it means is we are strategically positioning resources to protect our communities and to be able to respond quickly if necessary.
Deputy Chief Francisco Barreto states that the task force will work in partnership with the new Counter-Terrorism Unit, Security Unit, and other specialized units. He emphasizes that it will not replace Project Resolve, which was created in response to tensions stemming from the conflict in the Middle East.
Task Force Guardian will establish a highly visible deployment of uniformed officers equipped with tactical capabilities, including patrol carbines and protective gear. The deployment of these officers will be intelligence-driven in strategic locations throughout the city. These strategic locations can include community centers and places of worship, such as synagogues, and also critical infrastructure, high-traffic public spaces, and tourist attractions. We want to emphasize that if you see officers with such tactical capabilities downtown or around your neighborhood, it does not mean that there is an imminent threat. We will pick these locations strategically, but our aim is not to alarm anyone. It is part of a measured approach to keeping people safe. Task Force Guardian will work in partnership with the new Counter-Terrorism Unit, Security Unit, and with other specialized units such as Emergency Management and Public Order. This does not replace Project Resolute, which is our response to the tensions stemming from the conflict in the Middle East since October 7th, 2023.
This announcement speaks volume to the current state of our country. Remember, Canada has historically been one of the safest and most peaceful nations in the world, and now our leaders are forced to implement expansive preemptive measures to guard against the persistent threat of terrorism and radicalization. This is not just a policy adjustment, it represents a profound paradigm shift in what daily life in Canada is going to look like going forward. Sure, this action offers immediate reassurance to communities, but they feel more like a band-aid solution than a genuine fix. If the core issue is terrorism and violent extremism, the real solution almost certainly lies in preventing those responsible from entering our country in the first place. Yet, instead of confronting the problem head-on with honest and courageous clarity, our political and institutional leaders are constantly constrained by politically correct rhetoric. This is across the board. Canada deserves better than managed decline through endless proactive security measures. Note that they use the term proactive, but they are only proactively preventing an attack. In reality, they are reacting to the increased state of terrorist activity that is ever growing and ever more present in Canada. Our leaders need to have the goal to name the problem clearly and secure our borders and our society accordingly. So where is this threat coming from? Well, earlier this week, the Institute for Economics and Peace released the 2026 Global Terrorism Index. A press conference was held by Kyle Matthews, the Executive Director for the Montreal Institute for Global Security, Michael Collins from the Institute for Economics and Peace, and Phil Gursky, the President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting Limited. I want to note that Phil Gursky previously worked for CSIS, Canada's primary intelligence agency, from 2001 to 2015. Throughout the press conference, they highlighted the growing threat of terrorism not just facing Canada but the West as a whole. They did touch on some important points, such as a 280% increase in violent terrorist-related deaths in the West. They highlighted specific terrorist atrocities, such as the Bondi shooting and the U.S. terrorist attacks in New Orleans, the potential of Iran-backed militias operating in the West, and finally, Islamist and Jihadist terrorism being the predominant form of terrorism globally every year since the reporting began. I don't think there is a potential of Iran-backed militias operating in the West, so much as Iran-backed militias are almost certainly operating in the West. Phil Gursky himself notes that there are tens of thousands of persons of interest in the West later on during the question period, though I should note he doesn't specify which group he is speaking to specifically. And while they did a great job naming specific groups responsible for terrorism abroad, specifically in countries in the Middle East and Africa, they never quite tie that back to Canada, aside from the fact that events abroad could impact our country. Phil Gursky goes as far as to briefly touch on the fact that Canada is a country of diasporas and that there are people in Canada who would have strong feelings about what is happening back home in countries rife with terrorism.
As both Kyle and Michael mentioned, we are seeing an increasing worry about the after effects of what's happening, not just in Iran, but in Gaza and in southern Lebanon, as perhaps feeding terrorism here in Canada. We are a country of diasporas. We are a country where people do still have strong feelings of what's happening back home. And we may be seen by certain terrorist groups as being potentially some easy targets to hit. We saw the attack on the U.S. consulate in Toronto a couple of weeks ago, as well as attacks on Jewish synagogues and schools in the Greater Toronto area and elsewhere in Canada.
Kyle Matthews noted that youth radicalization is a serious problem and mentioned that many young Canadians have been radicalized and gone to Iraq and Syria to join ISIS.
I think Canada's seen youth radicalization as a serious problem. We saw a number of young Canadians who were recruited online, radicalized, and went to Iraq and Syria to join ISIS, commit atrocities there against minority groups. So we have a history of this happening in our country.
While it is extremely troubling that youth are being radicalized to fight abroad for terrorist organizations in Iraq and Syria, he completely glossed over a couple of the most important points and questions to be asked here. What is the source of radicalization? Islam. Who are they fighting for? Islamic terrorists. Some would say that's self-evident, but the concern is glossed over as a mere factoid that is only used to supplement the primary concern, online radicalization. But most importantly, if they are being radicalized by Islamic terrorists to operate abroad, there is nothing preventing them from being radicalized by Islamic terrorists to operate specifically within Canada. This was certainly hinted at by Phil Gursky earlier, but not in the clear and objective way that they are focusing on online radicalization itself. So what are their other concerns? According to Kyle Matthews, it's the private tech and the U.S. government not doing their job at moderating online content.
There's a concern that the private sector, big tech in the U.S. is not doing their job on this front. And it's very difficult for governments to kind of legislate because we've seen a reaction by the U.S. government to any regulation of online dangers as being seen as censorship, which I disagree with. But there needs more to be done. And we also have to look as well as Chinese social media platforms. They've been a source of radicalization, particularly around the Israel-Gaza war.
We're in Canada, Kyle. Michael Collins notes a primary concern around there not being a single concrete ideology, but a mix of ideologies behind global terrorist attacks.
Increasingly, there's not a concrete ideology either, which makes it even more difficult to be able to intercept. It's a mix of ideologies. And also the broader aspect of, a lot of this is perhaps less to the point in which it is less ideologically driven and it's more just driven around a fascination of violence, right, or a heightening of violence. In the report this year, there's an expert contribution from Julie Chernov that really speaks to a number of the different forums that are online, which is basically simply a glorification of violence for violence's sake. And that continues to be an increasing trend, not only in the West, but I think around the world as well.
Michael. The index shows that the top 20 deadliest attacks listed were all committed by Islamic terrorist groups. Out of all terrorist-related deaths reported, 89% were attributed to a specific terrorist group. 70% of all terrorist deaths were attributed to just 4 specific terrorist groups: the Islamic State, Islam; JNIM, Islam; TTP, Islam; and Al-Shabaab, Islam. There are other terrorist groups operating around the world. Those are just the 4 largest. A higher percentage of terrorist attacks have been attributed to an identifiable group in 2025 than in 2024, a trend that has continued since the report was first released. In the West specifically, politically motivated attacks are noted as rising to 30%. Examples of such attacks including the assassination of Charlie Kirk and the Dallas ICE facility shooting. Only 32% had no clear ideological determinant, which, important to note, doesn't mean they didn't have a clear connected motivation. It just means we don't know what that motivation was. While this is the case, 53 or 527 of the 990 total deaths were religiously motivated, almost all of which were caused by Islamic jihadist groups. The report itself states that Islamic terrorism is currently regarded as the most relevant terrorist threat to Europe. I want to note that the report also states that anti-Islamic narratives also thrive, particularly within far-right ecosystems, where they expand into broader conspiracy frameworks like the re-immigration discourse. Should we just ignore the data provided by your very own report? I guess we shouldn't turn to the religious texts, namely the Quran and Hadiths, which are the definitive political and theological authority on Islam, driving the historical and present action of theologically faithful Muslims around the world. So is there really a primary concern around there not being a single concrete ideology, but a mix of ideologies behind global terrorist attacks? I don't know, you tell me. Phil Gursky goes on to claim that the Tumblr Ridge shooting was not an act of terrorism, as there was no ideology behind it, that it was simply violence for violence sake.
You mentioned the mass shooting in Tumblr Ridge, British Columbia. I should point out that according to the Global Terrorism Index, that would not qualify as an act of terrorism. There was no ideology behind it. It was simply, as Michael said, somebody who glorified violence for the sake of violence. So I would caution not trying to mix too many things into this salad.
I will note that the Wikipedia page emphatically uses female pronouns for the biologically male shooter, whose name I will not mention. Do you think it's possible, or even likely, that there is an ever-increasingly violent ideology that the shooter may have identified with? One that may have had any sort of impact on the decision to commit such a heinous crime? This presents a perfect example of how even our intelligence agents, police forces, and political leaders are incapable of being able to make what should be a clear and obvious assertion of motive, or at the very least a probable cause. Due to the recency of the shooting, and out of respect for the victims' families, I'll leave it at that for now and move on.
And just maybe one closing comment. It's wonderful and it's great for the Canadian authorities that have prevented terrorist attacks in 2025. We did have a considerable number of people that were stopped before they were able to carry it out. So yes, we didn't have any deadly incidents, but we did have a lot of people that were planning to do so. Kudos to the authorities that were able to catch that and work with our partners of getting that intelligence early to protect Canadians from such violence.
Kyle Matthews notes that we can look positively on Canadian authorities being able to utilize our intelligence to apprehend terrorist actors prior to committing acts of terrorism. This again takes us back to my initial premise. which I will reiterate here. Instead of confronting the problem head-on with honest and courageous clarity, our political and institutional leaders are constantly constrained by politically correct rhetoric and are therefore forced to react to ongoing internal threats rather than preventing them from developing in the first place.
Maybe I just highlight one additional thing. It's perhaps less about ownership, and it's just about more the funnel almost that social media creates. So, you start with an algorithm that if you have, if you are already excited by or alternatively interested in violence, it already leads you down to more extremist routes. That then kind of sort of corrals you into a space where there are people who, think like you and progressively are more extremist as you go down that rabbit hole.
To prevent the risk of being labeled a critical theorist, I will say that I do believe Michael Collins is onto something when he states that social media algorithms can lead users down a path of extremism by creating a funnel that corrals them into a space with like-minded individuals. So what can our leaders do to deal with this problem? Firstly, stop with the politically correct rhetoric. Don't be afraid to call out the facts as they are presented. This means if Islam is the predominant source of terrorist activities around the globe, and has continuously been for as long as we have tracked such data, then just say it. Stop with the declaration that any criticism of Islam is tantamount to nothing more than Islamophobia. This leads to the second course of action. We need to stop importing people with any ties to radical Islam into our country. Full stop. If a background check shows any sort of theological connection to any Islamic fundamentalist group, then they should not be allowed to come to Canada. Period. Thirdly, stop with the mass immigration of people from regions that are antithetical to our culture. And for those who do come, which should be an extremely small number and specific use cases, they should be under a highly monitored long-term probation. Fourth, mental health of our youth is a concern, full stop. This doesn't need to stop at potential radicalization. Canadian leaders need to emphasize a dramatic refocusing on the mental health care and support without fear of politically correct backlash. And finally, if we're going to resort to censorship as part of the solution, limit it to the very thing Michael Collins touched on. Don't censor what is being shown to us, censor how it is being shown to us. Force social media companies to eliminate algorithmic-based content. Allow the content to be shown naturally. The vast majority of average people dislike content algorithms, and everyone is ensnared by them. This protects kids, it eliminates doom scrolling, and it prevents the aforementioned funneling of radical information to vulnerable youth. Perhaps these aren't the best solutions. Perhaps they are just a framework for something better. What do you think? I am sure we can all agree on one thing. If we have to resort to our police forces being stationed in military-style tactical gear as a continuous deterrent at places of worship and high public activity, then our leaders have failed us in one way or another. Critical Chris, out.